We're dealing with a coup, a regime change operation run by the same people who have done this over and over in Libya, in Ukraine, in Central America, these so-called banana republics. They're turning the United States into a banana republic.
Harley, how are you, sir?
Good. I was just going to type to you, I'm here and ready.
You're always ready. It's because you're always in the
Hopefully.
fight, Harley.
Well, how else can you do it?
Just got to get up in the morning, put your feet on the ground, and gird ourselves with our spiritual armor and hit the ground running.
And get moving.
That's right.
Yeah.
Friends, thanks so much for tuning in. I think the interview you're about to hear is one you're going to want to share with your friends, neighbors, and colleagues because it cuts to the core of the problems of the deep state that we now face and that Trump himself personally faces. Of course, with the arrest of Imran Awan, Debbie Wasserman Schultz's IT guy, on July 25th at Dulles International Airport, arrested for bank fraud, is what Stefan Molyneux is calling the single biggest scandal in U.S. government history. And I think he might be right based on what we're about to discover, or what should be discovered if the FBI and authorities do their job. Harley Schlanger's on the line right now to help me break it all down. Harley, how are you?
I'm doing fine, Sean. How are you?
Well, I'm doing very well, and before we get started about the détente that Trump is merely trying to achieve with Russia to prevent World War III and breaking down all of the deep state nefarious activities, I do want to let everybody know that SGT Report 2.0 is now live. Guys, I'm sorry if you had trouble getting to the site for the past 3 or 4 days. We had nothing but nightmares switching over to a platform that is mobile friendly and loads much, much faster. I think if you give us a chance again, you're going to find that the real news you find at SGT Report 24/7 is news that loads fast and looks great on your mobile device. So thanks so much for tuning in. Harley, where should we begin? You sent me a video that I do want to play some of about Russian hacking exposed as an inside job, which it definitely is. Where would you like to begin? And what are your thoughts about the arrest of Imran Awan at Dulles?
Well, I'd like to start with the report that was put out by the Veteran Intelligence Professionals for Sanity, the VIPs. That's Ray McGovern, Bill Binney, who was one of the first cybersecurity guys for the National Security Agency. They did what the FBI has not done and did not do. And this goes back to the Imran case. The FBI never got the Democratic Party's computer. They never did their own investigation. They just put out material that they said proved that this is a Russian coding operation. And what Bill Binney and a group of experts did is they broke it down, and they found out that as they report in this open letter to Donald Trump, what they say is that there were two separate distributions of material from the DNC. The first one was not a hack, but a leak. And they explain it in their report. You can get that from Consortium News, or I'm sure you'll post it. It's also described quite adequately in the LaRouche PAC video that you have. But then what happened is, because this was going to be leaked to WikiLeaks, the Democratic Party, the FBI, the CIA, someone came in and made it look like a hack job. But they made a fundamental mistake. They put it in Russian coding. Now, if the Russians were the ones who hacked, they're sophisticated enough to cover up that they had done it. And so what the VIPs are saying is that this was a leak, not a hack, from an insider in the DNC. And of course, that tends to point toward the infamous or well-known Seth Rich. Then the second point on this is that it means there never was a Russian meddling. It was a CIA operation that goes back to a 2015 operation run from London that was laundered through people like John McCain and various British spooks to John Brennan, who then set up a task force in the United States with the whole crew of Obama deep state people that was designed to create this Russia did it narrative. Now, the important thing to understand on this is that why they did it. They were terrified that their game would be over if Trump got elected and had a free hand to work with Putin and Russia, to work with the Chinese, eventually to work with the Europeans, against terrorism, against the deep state, and against Wall Street and the City of London. Because their system is so severely damaged that they can't keep it together if you have an alternative put in place. They were afraid that Trump was going to do that. And so they intervened with this Russia did it story for the purposes of not just distracting Trump, but they were blackmailing him. That's what Comey did when Comey went in to see him and showed him this sloppy British job that alleged that Trump had been compromised by video taken by Putin at a hotel in Moscow that's been discredited and disproven. But Comey did a J. Edgar Hoover, threatening Trump with that. And when Trump didn't bite and continued to move forward, including his meeting with Putin at the G20 summit, they escalated. Now, the escalation demonstrates what you and I have discussed before about what's the central problem Trump has. Both parties are corrupt. It's not just that there's a deep state. It's not just that there's a corrupt media, controlled media. It's that both parties are run by FBI blackmail and by Bush neocons and Nancy Pelosi liberals. And so you had this vote in the Congress, an overwhelming vote, to undermine what Trump was elected to do, which was to end the permanent wars. So I think if we start there, that's the big story, that we had an election of a president who was voted for because people didn't want Hillary, they didn't want war, they didn't want more bailouts. And since before he took office, there's been a coup underway to minimally stop him from carrying through his agenda, but probably to either impeach him or make him so unpopular that his assassination would come as a relief.
Okay, so that's a lot to digest, and I'm familiar with all of that information, so I guess there's no need to play this Russian hacking exposed as inside job video that you guys produced over at LaRouche, because you've just summarized it beautifully. But let me ask you this now. As it relates to the January 6th government memo that was released about supposedly Putin trying to hack or influence the U.S. election. Of course, the election was in November. They hurriedly produced this ridiculous document on January 6th, and the mainstream media has run with this meme, this narrative, ever since, that the Russians hacked the elections and 16 intelligence agencies agree that that's what happened. That's a complete lie. It's a complete fabrication, correct? It's not 16 intelligence agencies.
It's the essence of fake news. They made it all up. You had three people, Comey, Clapper, who is the director of national intelligence, and Brennan, working with top layer of British intelligence, the GCHQ, the so-called Five Eyes, who, if there was collusion or corruption, they would have ample evidence of it because they see everything that goes on. They see all the emails. They're eavesdropping on everything. They have nothing. They never had anything. But they use anonymous leaks and lies and then this fake Russian hacking story. And the only source they have that confirms the hacking story was CrowdStrike, which is run by an anti-Putin Russian emigre. So if the mainstream media were doing its job, this would have been laughed out of the arena on January 7th. Instead, as you point out, this has continued to be the story. I just was reading the New York Times today. What do they say? Well, Trump is hampered by his lack of accomplishments because of his focus on the Russia question. Well, why is he focused on the Russia question? Because that's all he gets. Now, I find it interesting, Sean, and I'm sure you do too, that when there are polls taken and they ask the American people, what are you concerned about? The most recent poll showed the American people, 6% were concerned about Russia, 35% healthcare, 12% terrorism, 12% jobs. So only 6% were concerned about Russia, but that's 75% of the media coverage. So we're dealing with a coup, a regime change operation run by the same people who have done this over and over in Libya, in Ukraine, in Central America, these so-called banana republics. They're turning the United States into a banana republic.
Yeah. Well, they're certainly trying. And standing in opposition to that is Trump. And, as should be noted, I think he just pulled the plug on funding the rebels in Syria. So that's a big story we can talk about, too. But let me just say this. Let's back up and let's talk about the arrest of Imran Awan at Dulles. Now, on July 24th, the FBI seized smashed hard drives from Imran Awan's home. And that's a big deal because he was Debbie Wasserman Schultz's IT guy on the payroll, making well above market rates for his job, and his brother too, for years is my understanding. And he was on her payroll right up until the day after he was arrested at Dulles. So Debbie Wasserman
It's
Schultz...
even worse than that. She continued to keep him on staff after 30 other congressional offices fired him. And she continued to defend him up to the point he was picked up at Dulles Airport.
Okay, and you'll recall the video of her threatening the D.C. police chief about getting one of her laptops back, telling him that if she didn't get it, there will be consequences.
Well, I think there's extenuating circumstances in this case, and I think that, working through my counsel and the necessary personnel, if that in fact is the case, and with the permission of through the investigation, then we'll return the equipment. But until that's accomplished, I can't return the equipment.
I think you're violating the rules when you conduct your business that way, and should expect that there would be consequences. I yield back.
This is a woman who's absolutely off the rails. She's obviously corrupt to the core. She was fired as the head of the DNC, or she had to resign because of her corruption. And she's in this stuff knee deep, as is Podesta, as is Hillary Clinton. So let's just talk about the importance of these seized, smashed hard drives from Imran Awan's home. Should Debbie Wasserman Schultz be freaking out? Is the FBI going to do its job? Because you'll recall that when the DNC said, hey, we were hacked, the election is fraudulent because the DNC servers were hacked, and the WikiLeaks emails that came out, that's because of Russian hacking. We know that's all a lie. We think it was Seth Rich. Kim.com says it was Seth Rich. Julian Assange has suggested it's Seth Rich, and now Seth Rich is dead. And Stephen Wasserman, the brother of Debbie Wasserman Schultz, is set to oversee the Awan family investigation. This, according to Squawker. Now, if that doesn't make your toes curl, I don't know what will.
It's worse than a banana republic. Now, but the important thing on this question of these computers and hard drives and so on is this is why Trump has been going after Sessions. Because Sessions not just recused himself on the flimsiest of grounds, but he's dragging his feet on investigating the crooked Hillary networks. He's dragging his feet on looking into the role of companies such as Fusion GPS, which has British intelligence written all over it that provided the initial document through Christopher Steele's work, the ex-MI6 guy. He's not doing anything to bring that to the Congress. He's not, as far as we know, he was dragging his feet on investigating who was leaking inside the Trump administration. And so we had this little momentary insight into that with Scaramucci when he came in and fired the whole Priebus crowd. Because if you remember, Priebus was the head of the Republican National Committee that was devastated by Trump's triumph, winning the nomination. And for Trump to bring in Priebus under the idea that he would help Trump win the general election was a big mistake. And we see that also, by the way, if Priebus were so useful, why couldn't he get the Republicans to do a better job on the repeal of Obamacare? Why couldn't he work with Trump to stop the sanctions bill, which is undermining the victory over terrorism in Syria and Iraq? So what we're dealing with in the Imran case is a singular example that intersects all the corruption. The DNC website, Wasserman Schultz's role, what was in the DNC emails. I mean, you hardly ever hear this spoken of, but you're worried about disrupting or meddling in an election? What about what the DNC did against Bernie Sanders and what they tried to do against Trump with this dossier they compiled, and then with the whole Russia story?
Yeah, can I jump in and ask you something, though?
Sure.
You just hit on something really important. What did they know? How did they meddle in the election? The DNC, you just mentioned something important that I want to circle back to, the DNC lawsuit, because of what was done to Bernie Sanders. Now, we have two attorneys down in the Florida area, Jared Beck and I believe it's Elizabeth Lee Beck, who fear for their lives because their witnesses keep dropping dead. Branton Wisnot Jr., a federal prosecutor in Debbie Wasserman Schultz's own district, was found dead on a Florida beach with a headshot, we believe, to the back of his head. And these folks, Jared and Elizabeth Lee Beck, have tried to appeal to the court to provide protection U.S. Marshals protection for themselves and their witnesses and their staff because they've received threats. One of the threats was a voice-morphed call that was fishing for information about the case, and the caller ID linked directly back to Debbie Wasserman Schultz's phone, her congressional office. On the record, fact, they have a screenshot of it. And you don't hear this talked about on CNN. You don't even hear it talked about. I think probably maybe Hannity would cover it on Fox. But otherwise, in the mainstream media, you don't hear any of this talked about, Harley.
No, you don't, and there's a reason for it, because the whole case is so flimsy. And this is something, let me just tell you what Lyndon LaRouche said needs to be done, because this whole thing can be broken open. If Trump were to hold a press conference and release the VIP's report, the report which shows that the hacking was probably done, or there was a leaking, and then the hacking was probably done by the CIA or an agency, a private agency under the CIA's direction. And if Trump then said, we're going to investigate this, we're going to find out who made up this story, who's been leaking it to the media, who's been undercutting my administration, which is your presidency, and then identify what we do know about the intersection of the Obama team, which includes in particular Brennan, Comey, and Clapper, and their hostility toward cooperation with Russia. Just last week, Clapper and Brennan were at a conference in Aspen, and they denounced Trump, saying that he dishonored the country by meeting with Putin. Now, how does it dishonor a country to, even if the person's your enemy, to sit down and talk with them? And they accused Trump by questioning the intelligence community's findings. And as you pointed out earlier, it's not the whole intelligence community, it's a small task force led by the three of them. They said that by questioning that, Trump is demoralizing our patriotic men and women in the CIA and holding them back from doing their jobs. Like what? Assassinating Assad, assassinating Putin, carrying out more regime change? The CIA should be demoralized because they've just been caught in illegal, unconstitutional activity. They meddled. The British meddled in the U.S. election, not the Russians.
Well, that's absolutely right. Now let me ask you about Mueller. It seems to me that right now, instead of a special prosecutor being assigned by Jeff Sessions to look into Hillary Clinton's crimes, it's President Trump that is really enduring a special prosecutor trying to dig up and ruin him. And that comes in the form of Robert Mueller. So tell me about that. How off the constitutional rule of law is this whole Mueller witch hunt, number one? And number two, do you think Trump is right by tweeting out essentially accusing Sessions of being soft on Clinton?
Oh, he is right about it. I mean, Sessions should be bringing these leakers out. Sessions should be looking at the who it was that actually was involved in hacking and leaking. So that's one important point about it. But when you bring up Mueller, you want to talk about a conflict of interest or collusion. Mueller is very close to Comey. How do you bring in the previous FBI head to investigate the firing of the current FBI head? You look at Mueller's career. It's Wall Street. It's the Bush networks. Mueller, and this is just an interesting point, in 1988, he got one of his big breaks. It was to head the Get LaRouche task force that was set up by George Herbert Walker Bush to try and eliminate Lyndon LaRouche as a figure in American politics.
I didn't know that, but it makes perfect sense. He was also in charge on September 11th, 2001, and we know how well the FBI investigated that false flag.
Well, he covered up every aspect of what happened on 9/11, whether you want to talk about inside job, what the Bush family knew, what Cheney knew, the Saudi role, but he also worked hand in hand with the NSA in putting together the police state, the whole metadata collection and so on. So, and the media calls him a straight shooter. They give Clapper a pass. Clapper admitted that he lied in congressional testimony on what the NSA was doing. So you have a through the looking glass world. I mean, it's almost impossible to imagine how bizarre this is if you actually had real investigation and real intelligence being put out on the news. That's where Sessions comes in. He has a mandate as Attorney General to find out what's going on. He's not doing it. Now, let me just bring in one other element that I think is really interesting, which is the whole line that Putin's corrupt, Putin's a killer, you can't trust the Russians. One of the most important people in making this case is a man named Bill Browder. You know who he is, Sean? You know him?
No, I'm not familiar with him.
He's the one who just testified the other day. Browder was a partner of something called Hermitage Capital, which was sent into Russia in 1995 to carry out the privatizations. He became a billionaire in his role in doing this. He was one of the people who was laundering money out of Russia, working with the Boston Consulting Group, the Harvard Group, and others, that Putin came in to stop. Now, two really interesting things about this guy Browder. His grandfather was Earl Browder, who was the general secretary of the Communist Party in the United States from the 1930s through the end of World War II. That's how he got his entree into Russia. Secondly, his partner was none other than the drug money, dope money, gun-running launderer Edmund Safra of Safra Bank, who put up the money to set up Browder. Browder renounced his U.S. citizenship and became a British citizen. And now he's being brought in as an expert witness on Putin's corruption. So, and he, by the way, is the one that was involved in getting this Magnitsky law passed, which is at the heart of this whole Donald Trump Jr. story. And that's another whole diversion that I think we can just ignore, except that it's the same dirty networks of drug money laundering, Hong Kong Shanghai Bank, Edmund Safra, who is an international criminal who was fleeing for his life the last 10 years of his existence. And they're investigating money laundering for Trump when these guys were the ones who robbed Russia blind and Putin stopped it. I just think the whole thing is so bizarre that if people knew the real story, they would just stand up and say, we've got to defend the president. He may be a little strange in certain ways, he does things, but he's fighting for us. He's trying to stop the wars. He's prepared to move against Wall Street if we go out and give him the support. And one of the things I'm hoping is that your listeners will get this VIPS report, the VIPS report, and watch the video. I'm sure you'll post it eventually on your site, the Rushpak video, that explains who did the hacking and explains the crime that was committed by the CIA so that we can make this a household knowledge.
Yeah, you bet. In fact, what I'm going to do, Harley, is I will play that 4.5-minute video at the conclusion of this interview. So you guys stay tuned. That'll be the snippet that you're going to want. I would say share this entire interview with everybody that you care about. Anybody that you know that cares about the Constitution and the rule of law, this is the interview you should share. Now, you said something very important early on in this last snippet you just shared with us. You said the mainstream narrative is essentially that Putin's a killer. Let's just talk about that for a second, because I find it very interesting that according to the WikiLeaks Podesta emails, an email sent and received by Podesta, John Podesta, on February 9th at 4:36 p.m., February 9th, made mention of wet works and a very hard night ahead. Just 4 days later, on February 13th, in Shafter, Texas, Supreme Court Justice Vincent Scalia was dead. No investigation, no autopsy, just dead. So let's talk about this Putin's a killer meme. Let's see if we find any circumstantial evidence that might suggest that the real killers are domestic in nature and possibly associated with the DNC.
Well, let's take an interesting point on that. If they're so convinced Putin's a killer, why were they doing so much business with him? What about Hillary's deal on the uranium? What about Podesta's deals with Russia? What about Bill Clinton speaking and getting speaking fees and money from the Russians?
Well, that's right.
You know, all of a sudden, they discover Putin's a killer?
Well, with no evidence. I mean, they don't ever provide any evidence for their character assassination. And I'm not in Putin's camp. I'm just definitely standing against the DNC criminality and the Podesta, Debbie Wasserman Schultz, Hillary Clinton crime network. And all of these other people in this crime network that's gone on for decades, and the Mueller story and all of this other stuff we've discussed, one of the things we've left out of this is the plight of human trafficking. Child sex trafficking is real. Pedogate is real. We've proved it. It's not even beyond a shadow of a doubt. It's just a fact, right? And we know that Steve Scalise, Representative Steve Scalise, was going to do, was shot was there was an assassination attempt made on Representative Steve Scalise's life. He was targeted by an assassin, in my opinion, and it was Scalise who made a PSA talking about the plight and the plague of human trafficking in the United States, and that it needs to be exposed and brought to an end.
One of America's greatest values is our strong belief in the inherent worth of every human life. Human trafficking is a direct assault on this core value, and it affects millions of victims throughout the world. While many of us would like to believe that this issue isn't something that affects us, the sad truth is that human trafficking is a real problem plaguing each and every community here in the United States. Enough is enough. This week, the House took strong actions to stand up for the victims of human trafficking, passing tough bills to provide them protection and to target child predators. Let's work together to get these bills signed into law.
And they tried to kill him. So that's another evidence of domestic killers here in our midst. Another one is John O'Shea, the former UN diplomat, who was said to have died in a weightlifting accident in June 2016 when he dropped a barbell on his neck and crushed his thorax. All right, who else do we have? Mike Flynn, the Breitbart editor who died June 23, 2016. The next day, his article, Clinton Cash, Bill and Hillary Created Their Own Chinese Foundation in 2014, was published. We've got, trying to see my notes here, we have Seth Rich, of course, and Sean Lucas, the process server, right?
Well,
Sean?
how about this? How about I just read a report, 127 people are dying every day from opioid addiction. Where does that come in? I mean, the big pharma, the government policy, the so-called war on drugs, the lies about the strong economy, the fact that there are so many forgotten men and women who are desperate, who can't afford housing, can't afford anything, and turn to drugs as a relief. These are deaths that should be on the hands of these globalists. And then I think this is a really important point, Sean, when you talk about the question of who's the killers. The fact that for a number of years, and this is a fact, that Obama had a policy of arming terrorists in Syria as part of the regime change against Assad. And they were killing large numbers of people in Syria, beheading Christians and Shia Muslims and also Sunni Muslims who didn't go along with them. The fact that we continued, and by we I mean the Obama administration, continued this policy. Hillary was going to expand it. And then Trump, as you pointed out earlier in the interview, Trump ended the arming of the fiction of the so-called moderate rebels. And the very time he ended that, the Congress votes up these sanctions to try to scuttle the possibility of U.S.-Russian cooperation right at the point that ISIS and al-Qaeda are on the run. So this network is guilty of mass murder and has been for years. The regime change wars. Look how many Americans have died in this. Look how many people have been victims of terror. And the terrorists go back to Bush and Obama. So, to hear lectures about Putin, is the worst form of hypocrisy. And the fact that Putin and Trump had a discussion at the final dinner of the G20 to try and make that into a surreptitious, hidden, secret meeting when it was in front of all the heads of state. I mean, this is where you see the complete corruption of a media in cooperation with the CIA, the FBI, the deep state operations, the Wall Street bankers, and so on, trying to shut down the story. Now, the final piece here, which I think we just have to, you may have something else you want to bring in, but I just want to bring up the case of Scaramucci. Because whatever else this was all about, he went in and basically said, if you're leaking, you're going to be caught. And they got rid of Priebus. And then, in a sense, Scaramucci fell on his sword. But he did his job. He opened the story that Trump is serious about ending this. And we'll see what Kelly does. I don't know what General Kelly will do. But Trump is now making the point in his private discussions that he doesn't trust the Democrats or the Republicans, but he trusts the people. And I think what he did last week when he went to Youngstown, Ohio, is what he should be doing every week. Go out and talk to the Americans who are the victims of the Bush administration and the Obama administration. Go out and say to them, here's what I'm going to do to work with you to put an end to this deep state. And if he were to do that, he would rally a bigger majority or a larger number of people than he did in the 2016 election.
Yep. Yeah, I agree. And I do want to circle back here at the end, if you remind me. I want to talk about the opioid epidemic and the heroin epidemic, right? Because this all comes back to not only big pharma, but the heroin epidemic falls at the feet of the Bush CIA, the Afghanistan opium production, and the drug running into this country. I feel like we in this country are now the victim of the opium wars that the Chinese once endured at the hands of the British. It is now being turned around on us. They are trying to destroy our families and our children with heroin and with opioids, and they're doing a damn good job of it. An 18-year-old boy just died in our neighborhood, in our town. We live in a very small town. The oldest of 4 kids, 18 years old, and he just died 2 weeks ago from opioids. Illegally gotten opioids. So I'm mad as hell about it. We can talk about that if you want, or maybe we just did. But
just add one quick point to that. If you look at the sexual trafficking, you look at the opioid and drug pushing, you look at Wells Fargo Bank, you look at Hong Kong Shanghai Bank, you look at the players, and what you see is this upper 1% that think they're better than everyone else, who have gotten away with murder and thievery for especially the last 17 years. But it actually goes back longer than that. These are the people who are running the coup against Trump. And if the American people are serious about winning our nation back, we have to stand up against them. And I think we have to pick out the main fight. And right now, that's to identify who's pulling the coup and why. And the fact that they are completely desperate. One just footnote on that. Today, the European Union just ruled, or just put forward, that they're going to put a new rule out that will allow them to shut down the ability to withdraw funds from an account for between 10 and 30 days in the case of a systemic crisis.
Oh, wow.
So this is now out in the open, what the banks are planning to do with your savings and deposits.
Yeah, well, I just did an interview about that, Harley, and the collapse is coming, and you're right, the banks are preparing. And how do we, and maybe we can, how do we address or educate those who are ideologically opposed to us, right? Because I listen to the Mark Maron podcast a lot when I work out. I think he's an interesting interviewer. He tends to stay out of politics, and he brings on interesting guests. And I just listened to an interview with him and Randy Newman, the guy who did all the Toy Story music, and he's a legendary musical artist going back decades. And they both, although they didn't really get into politics, they continued several times to lament the disaster of the current administration. And every time Mark Maron comes on, he basically says a verbal prayer about, and he's not religious, but basically says a prayer saying, please help us get through this disaster in human history, and he's referring to Trump every single time. How is it that these people are so intellectually dishonest that they cannot see what is plainly obvious here? That the DNC, that Clinton, that Podesta, that Debbie Wasserman Schultz, and the powers that be, and the powers that wanted to continue to be, are corrupt to the core. It just astounds me. Are these people intellectually dishonest, or are they just stupid?
Or corrupt. I mean, some of them have been bought off. They have comfortable lives. Look at the congressmen. They have comfortable lives. On the one hand, they'll get money from lobbyists. They'll get retirement funds. They have their life taken care of them after they're done. On the other hand, the FBI has files on all of them. So if you want to avoid discomfort, go along. And you may seem to be stupid. Some of them are stupid. But I think there's a corruption and there's a police state terror that's targeting top people in this country who might otherwise do something else. But you see people like Ron Paul. I have been very interested in watching him defend the Trump administration, even though he's not a great fan of Trump, against this coup. You look at someone like Paul Craig Roberts or David Stockman, people who I don't necessarily agree with on economics, but they're identifying that there's an enemy operation in our country. What we have to do is, the people who are corrupt and immoral and won't listen, we can't do anything about them until we have a majority. We've got to go out and organize the people who recognize they're being treated like slaves, that they're being ignored and forgotten and trampled on, and give them an understanding of who's doing it and why, and what the potential of this country would be if we address the real problem, which is the Wall Street looting and swindles and speculation. That could be done. The president is in the best position to do that. But he needs help from the American people who know something about this. And instead of sitting there and crying in your beer that nothing can be done, go out and do something. Talk about it. Spread the word. We're at a point where we could have a successful, maybe a third American revolution. And that's what we have to do.
Yeah. We need to purge this deep state, and part of that is also exposing what is now widely known as pedogate, and that's the global plague of child sex trafficking and human trafficking in general, actually. Harley, as soon as this is done, guys, and we say goodbye to Harley, stay tuned because we're going to play the 4-minute and 38-second video from LaRouche PAC. It's titled Russian Hacking Exposed as an Inside Job. So stay tuned for that. And Harley, final word for you. How can folks find your great work?
Well, LaRouchePAC.com is the best place, and if I've been writing an article a week, if people would like to get the latest article, they can send me an email, and I'll send it out, and I will get back to you. I promised this, and I've done it. So you can send it to me at harleysch@gmail.com. And if you would post that, Sean, so people could see it, I'd be happy to send you the latest article to give you a sense of what we're doing to expose this.
Yeah, because you are working hard every day, and guys, Harley's not on our shores anymore. He's actually in the EU. Harley, I don't know if you want to disclose exactly where you are, but you're very public, and you're meeting with officials, and you're giving speeches, and you're really doing a lot to educate people in leadership positions over there, and you're waking them up to what we've just talked about in many ways, and you're waking them up to the crimes of the EU and the big banks, and you're just doing God's work, Harley, and I want to thank you for that.
Well, and you know, with drones, they can always find where I am. So my only security is for people to read it and talk about it, because that's really the only way you can protect yourself, is to wage an active war against the deep state.
And guys, I do want to leave everybody with this final sad note. A good friend to SGT Report, Catherine Frisk, has passed away, and it was our friend Mark Anthony Taylor who has filed numerous lawsuits against the big international banks that have colluded to fix the gold and silver prices. He's naming names. Some of these people appear to be pedophiles. He's naming names. He's put his life at considerable risk, and it was our friend Catherine Frisk. Her real name was Gail. She ran the site theinternationalreporter.org, and she was a friend of mine personally. I'd corresponded with her by email many, many times, and we had planned to do our first interview here in mid-August. She went missing a couple of weeks ago. Mark Anthony Taylor was extremely concerned because she was really one of the only websites in the world sharing his lawsuit information on a regular basis. We at SGT Report posted some of it, but she really posted as much as she could. She went missing 2 weeks ago, and she's turned up dead. The cause of death is said to be heart failure. There is apparently, we think, more to the story. Mark Anthony Taylor is looking into that, as is our friend Really Graceful on YouTube. She also is looking into it. There appear to be some anomalies, but my heart goes out to Catherine Frisk. May she rest in peace. She was a very, very good woman, and we'll miss her. So, with that said, Harley, again, thank you so much, and do stay safe.
I will. My pleasure, son. Talk to you soon.
All right. And guys, thank you so much for tuning in. Now, without further ado, here's the LaRouche PAC video, Russian Hacking Exposed as an Inside Job. God bless.
Yesterday, a group of former U.S. intelligence professionals who call themselves the Veteran Intelligence Professionals for Sanity, they released a memo demolishing the claim that Vladimir Putin and the Russians hacked the U.S. election to put Donald Trump in office. Specifically, they refute the January 6th assessment by hand-picked members of a few U.S. intelligence agencies, which had claimed that, quote, Russian President Vladimir Putin ordered an influence campaign in 2016 aimed at the U.S. presidential election to put Donald Trump in office. According to that January 6th government memo, in addition to unleashing a supposedly fearsome army of internet trolls, as well as launching Russian propaganda through the stealthily named TV station Russia Today, the government document claimed that Russian military intelligence used a hacker known as Guccifer 2.0 to hack the DNC and release material to WikiLeaks. This material went on to prove embarrassing for the Clinton campaign and revealed that the Democratic National Committee had undercut Clinton rival Bernie Sanders in the primaries. WikiLeaks maintained that the material they published was a leak, not a hack, and that it did not come from Russia. At the time, the Veteran Intelligence Professionals for Sanity insisted that all evidence pointed towards the material being a leak, rather than a hack. Now, shortly after WikiLeaks announced that it had this DNC material last June, this new internet persona, Guccifer 2.0, appeared on the scene, claiming that he hacked the DNC and then scooped WikiLeaks by releasing several DNC documents. The metadata on some of these documents included a last modified user named Felix Edmundovich, written in Cyrillic, named after Felix Edmundovich Dzerzhinsky, the first head of the Soviet secret police. Whoops. Then, clumsy interviews by Guccifer 2.0, who claimed to be Romanian, revealed that he was not actually familiar with that language and was perhaps hiding his true identity. Were presented as evidence that it was Russian involvement, that Guccifer 2.0 was a Russian hack aimed at influencing the US election. Now, the VIPS memo, which came out yesterday, and which cites research by the Forensicator and by Adam Carter, offers forceful forensic evidence pointing to the deliberate planting of Russian metadata and the source of the files coming from Guccifer 2.0 being direct local access to the DNC network, not a remote computer hack. The speed of the transfer of the files, later released by Guccifer 2.0, was far too quick to have been made over an internet connection, but was consistent with copying over a local network, or to a USB external drive or a flash drive. Times embedded within the metadata of the files and the archives point to the file manipulation being performed in the Eastern time zone. This was not a hack. The later addition of the Russian metadata, including Felix Edmundovich's name, was also done deliberately. So what does all of this mean? After WikiLeaks announced that it had material from the DNC, an operation was launched to add Russian fingerprints and produce a second supposed leak of material. Now, there's more on all of this, so I encourage you to read the full memo, which calls for the president to investigate the CIA, particularly former Director John Brennan, and the FBI for the phony hack and the fake Russian attribution. Keep in mind that all of this is occurring because of Donald Trump's orientation towards a détente with Russia and against the ongoing warfare being promoted by actors known as the deep state in the United States. The president has to fight back against these agencies to be able to pursue his own policy, and fighting back on this Russiagate in a forceful way is key to making that happen.
The stocks, the bonds, the mutual funds, the ETFs, the annuities, the CDs, the savings, this is what it's based on. So if you have something that's created from dollars, pays you out in dollars, and can only pay you back in dollars, when the dollar goes to zero and it's at 4 cents now, what's the value of those things? So what happens to those people that are depending upon them? Look at Venezuela.